Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Engineering Ethics webinar. My name is Mike Fitch with the Ohio LTAP Center here at ODOT, and we appreciate your participation in this training. As we get started, please take a moment to locate the questions box in the GoToWebinar panel. During the presentation, please use the questions box to send in any questions you might have, and we'll be glad to discuss those items by the end of the session. Please note also that the handouts section of your GoToWebinar panel includes a PDF copy of the presentation for reference. With that, we will go ahead and turn things over to Mr. Dean Ringle. Dean, hello, and thanks so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you, Mike. Appreciate that. Appreciate the opportunity. Again, my name is Dean Ringle. I'm currently serving as the Executive Director for the County Engineers Association of Ohio. In a former life, I was served as a Franklin County engineer and enjoyed that job immensely. Enjoy what I'm doing now. And as a little side note, as if I'm not busy enough, I'm also on the State Board of Registration for professional engineers and surveyors. So, you know, some of the talk today will be based on that. And if you have any questions on that, feel free to ask them or email me later if you have some questions. Probably to start off with, I need to say it's only 37 days till spring, and you know, here it is, cold, it's snowy, and it's a good day to be in, I guess, on the computer and paying attention to something. But I appreciate everybody's you know, time to come and listen to this topic. You know, if we were a year ago, February of 2020, this had a pretty good potential of being an in-person conference. In 2022, a year from now, we don't know. We hope we'll probably do virtual and in-person conferences, but for now, we have in-person. Little benefit to that, I guess a year ago, if you had been trying to get last minute signed into this, or actually in attendance in person, you would have been facing an ethical dilemma. I'm running late. Is it ethical to speed to get on time to an ethics presentation? I'll let you think on that for a little bit. And obviously, if you're running late, the idea of sneaking into the back of an auditorium or a conference room doesn't work, because all those back seats got taken by the early people and you'd have to sit in the front. So everybody would know you came in late. And now, hopefully you're on time, but if you're not, it's kind of hard to tell anyway, except the computer. But for the rest of us attendees, glad you're here, and we'll talk about ethics being the big E. One of the things we look at, I guess, is why are you taking this? You know, I'm going to talk to a group that's probably mostly engineers and surveyors, or you work with engineers and surveyors, even if you aren't one. So you have to deal with that group of people. And there's ethics always comes into play at some point in time in discussions or in actions. And it's something that we do have to pay attention to and to know what it is. As far as our profession goes, it's been described in the past as a three-legged stool. And many of you know, if you sit in a chair that has four legs, and if the floor is uneven, or you know, something's one of the legs is a little bit different length than the others, it wobbles. And if you have a three-legged stool, it's a pretty stable structure. It can absorb some of the anomalies in a uneven floor. And if one leg's shorter than the other, it still can stand, not too different. And so our profession being described as the three legs being education, experience, and examination. And that in itself is the background of getting to the professional engineer or professional surveyor status. We have to go through the education process, through schooling, through the coursework. Then we have some experience, because you can't learn everything by the book. You have to go and experience it, and you go through that, learn from others, as you're going through that stage. And then of course the examination to make sure the principles are absorbed well, and you've got those 3 areas. So as you look at those 3 areas, the question becomes, where does ethics fit in? Is it a 4th leg? And if we're not careful, if we just think I've done those three areas, education, experience, and examination, Theodore Roosevelt probably had a pretty good quote to say that's probably not enough. Because as he quotes, to educate a person in mind and not in morals is to educate a menace to society. So he kind of understood that you've got to have some ethics and morals to be able to, what are we supposed to do? Protect the public, right? That's one of the reasons we have our licenses, not just to be able to build things. So the question then becomes, where does ethics fit in to this 3-legged stool that we have? Is it just in education? Is it we just talk about it and teach it in school? Or is the ethics part of the experience where we go out and now we say, okay, now we have a conflict, or what are we going to do in this? Or is it part of examination process where we just ask ethical questions and see how the answers come out? I think the real answer is it really fits in all areas. So it's not a leg by itself. It's kind of like the blanket that covers up our entire profession, our person. And so if you consider the stool or the chair that we have, the 3-legged stool, it's like a paint or a stain, and that paint or stain covers, it permeates, it soaks into every area. So ethics actually goes into the education side. It goes into the experience, and it goes into the examination, and it covers all other areas too of our lives and what we're doing. So things to think about as we go through this. So that's why I've labeled this the Big E, and it's the Big E or it's the Big E, depending on how you look at it. But it is something that is important for our profession. It's important for the protection of the public. It's important to know what the values are that we have in not just in our engineering and surveying areas, but also in society in general. Somebody, and maybe one of the teasers to this ethics session was the difference between theoretical and practical ethics. Is there a difference? And I would basically say that it's pretty hard to separate out ethics and be ethical in one area and say, well, it doesn't matter in another area. So it really covers your whole being, your whole purpose, your whole life. And so you can't just say, okay, I'll be ethical at work and then have some issues in your personal life, or you can't be ethical in your personal life and not be it at work. It needs to be throughout what you do. So kind of brings us to the point of, why are you here? We have a lot of people, close to 400 that have signed up to sit through this. And other than the fact that it's a cold day outside and I'm working from home or whatever, you still had a choice of not signing up or signing up. So why are you here? Hopefully it's to learn a little bit more about ethics, to be reminded of some of the things that maybe you forgot about that were part of a learning process in the past, or maybe it'll just be some new things to think about on how ethics actually fits into our lives. So one of the reasons you might be here is that it's actually in the Ohio Revised Code. If you're a professional engineer or professional surveyor licensed in either of those, you know that you have to have at least 2 hours out of the 30 over a 2-year period that you have to have in ethics or in the rules of engineering or surveying. And so it's a reminder. So a lot of people forget and think I get 2 every year, and you really don't. It's because now we're in a biennial 2-year cycle. You need to get 2 out of the 30 hours, 15 hours a year average. You need to have that each 2-year cycle. But a lot of you will take more than that, and that's okay. You're either you're either overachievers or extra cautious, but you want to take extra ethical courses, and you're allowed to. You can have more than 2 hours in a 2-year period, and if you can take up to 2 hours to carry over into the next 2-year cycle as part of the 15 that you carry over into the next 2-year cycle. So there's some benefit to being proactive, to being able to take some of these courses and use them so that you can have them not only for this term but also for the next term. And just as a reminder, if you are keeping track, at the end of 2021 will be the end of the 2-year cycle. So you'll want to make sure you've got all your courses lined up and which ones are going to be able to be carried over. Somebody today asked me how many hours of ethics are we limited to? And I go, well, basically, you need to get some engineering or surveying courses in your 30 hours of the 2-year cycle. But you could have 10 hours, 12 hours, of ethics, and be able to use those, because there's different things. It's not just one ethics talk is the same as the other. Hopefully you'll find out some different things, but you've got some options and choices on what you're going to do. So again, hopefully as you're looking forward, this is either meeting your 2 hours or you're now being able to use it for the next cycle and be able to use them then. So then the question becomes, what do we mean when we talk about ethics? It could mean different things to different people. I always like to go with the dictionary definition. But one of the things that I think sometimes we not confuse, but kind of interpret differently is the fact that our ethics and morals the same thing. They're very, very similar. If we go to Webster's dictionary, it basically states that morals are relating to principles of right and wrong behavior, morals expressing or teaching a concept of right or wrong, conforming to a standard of right behavior. Whereas ethics, from their definition, says it's the discipline of dealing with what is good and bad, and with moral duty and obligation. So there you're using the term moral inside your definition of ethics. A set of moral principles or values. So you have morals that you have lined up or listed, and that set of themselves becomes a statement of ethics. And it's listed as the principle of conduct governing an individual or a group. So you could have an ethics statement from a group, such as we have those with our National Society of Professional Engineers, National Society of Professional Surveyors, and some other groups. We also have ethics listed in our state codes. So I think that's important to remember, to pay attention to. So generally, being moral implies conformity to established sanctioned codes or accepted notions of right and wrong. And ethics then suggests an involvement of maybe some more difficult questions of rightness, fairness, or equity. In other words, when we talk about being held to the highest ethical principles, are things to look at. So we do have codified ethics laws. And just like you had the section of 4733.151 as the ethics section, you also have some other sections that are within the engineers and surveyors code. But the code of ethics that is in the law at 4733.151, those are things that in 35, those are ones that have to be held by everybody. So you've got an Ohio Ethics Commission, which I'll refer to a couple times. That is not something just for public officials. I think that we need to be reminded of this if we're working in government. We're working as a public employee. It is for all of us. And the Ethics Commission may seem like they come down a little harder on public officials, and there are some specific rules that public officials need to follow. But it's for all areas: state, local, school boards, anything you serve on that is a public entity, you're underneath the Ohio Ethics Commission and the ethics laws. It doesn't matter whether you're full or part-time. So you can't get off by saying, I'm just working part-time, it's okay. No, it's anything you, as a public employee, you need to be aware of that you fall under these laws. And that includes, college also. So those who do business with public officials, they threw that caveat in too. So it's not just you as an employee. If you are doing business with public officials, and again, public officials can be the elected person or it could be a non-elected person that's again serving the public. Anybody that's doing business with you are also subject to these. It's two things. It's if they offer you something wrong, substantial that you shouldn't accept. If you accept it, it's a problem. If they've offered it, it's a problem. So you have both sides to look at that. So the codes of ethics and conduct for state licensing boards is in the administrative code. So the revised code has an ethics section that talks in generalities about the ethics that you have to follow. But specifically for engineers and surveyors, we have in the administrative code, fortunately it's the same chapter and subchapter 4733, in this case -35, is where the code of ethics is. And that's where it talks about what we have to do in terms of protecting the public. So good to know and good to refer to once in a while. In fact, I included both those categories, both those the numbers of the code, so that you can go and just go ahead at your time, go ahead and read through them, kind of look at the different areas of what's expected of us as people and us as professional engineers or professional surveyors. So in the next section, there's some cases that have appeared before the State Board of Registration. And I wanted to share some of those with you. There's a lot of things that come before the State Board. And some of them, we get complaints on engineers and surveyors that have to be investigated. And a lot of them don't have merit. People are upset because a surveyor walked on their property or didn't notify them, and the engineer said something that they didn't like or whatever. So we have to investigate any complaints that come before the State Board, but not all of them go to the board for action. A lot of them are more frivolous and not based on merit. But sometimes things do come to the board that the board has to review and then take some action on. I will say that we hold a license, and realizing that holding a license for engineering and surveying is not a right. In fact, that even says that in our code. The code says that it's a privilege that we hold, and the whole point of us holding this is to be able to protect the public and hold that up as utmost. So one of the things that happens if something comes before the State Board in the form of a complaint, there's several other things that may happen first. It may be that the Ohio Ethics Commission has a complaint that they are investigating. It could be in the courts of law that there's something going through the court system that could be a complaint. If in either of those cases there's a companion complaint that's been filed, usually the State Board, and part of the investigation process, we need to wait until the Ethics Commission has made a ruling or that the courts of law had made a ruling. It seems more appropriate to have them in their particular bailiwick be able to finalize their decision making, and then we can decide. Because if it's thrown out in the court, then that bears a lot of weight with the board. And if there's a conviction in the court, then that bears a lot of weight with the board. So I think for practical purposes, a lot of times people say, hey, this person's doing something wrong. You do something with this license, it may have to go to the Ethics Commission first, or if it's a case that would go to the court, we'd want to have them look at it first. So then it goes to the Board of Registration. Now, one of the things that is also in our code, in the administrative code, so you want to read through this, is that if you are licensed in multiple states, if you have a problem with your license in another state, you are required to report that to Ohio. And the same, if something happened in Ohio, you're required to report that to another state. Most of the states have that reciprocity of knowledge, so that if a registrant is licensed in one state, the other state does find out about it. In our laws, it says you need to let us know that was something that happened. Maybe your license was suspended for whatever reason, or even worse, if it was revoked. We're required to know that. And so it's like a lot of things. If you don't tell us and we find out the other way, well, now you're in trouble two ways. One is, of course, that you had something happen, and two, you didn't tell us. And that's, life's history, I guess, whether it's a parent or a coworker. Sometimes you get in trouble for not saying something when you should have said, and sometimes that makes it even worse. So you just have to know that if you are licensed in more than one state, that you need to report any actions that occur in those states to all the other states, because almost everybody has the same law. So if there's actions in other states, sometimes those become before the state board in terms of review of the license. So interesting enough, of course, we're a board that has both engineering and surveying on the same board. Some other states have architects combined, some have geologists combined, photogrammetrists combined. We just happen, and some of them have engineering and surveying on separate boards. And so in Ohio, we just have the one board of engineering and surveying. And so it's interesting looking through the years at what happens on the cases that come before us. Sometimes you think, okay, I'm building things right, I'm putting in a factor of safety right, so it's not going to collapse, I'm not going to have an issue here, I should be good. And so one part of being licensed is, am I properly performing my duties as a licensed professional engineer or licensed professional surveyor? But the other side of that is, it's the ethical side. So you got the practice side and you got the ethical side that still could come to the state board, both for engineering and surveying. So those are the cases that can come before us. It's interesting. It's more cut and dried, obviously, when it's an engineering or surveying practice or principle or point of law, because those are pretty well black and white. Ethics takes a little bit more investigation, determination, and looking at the code of ethics that we have. So probably historically, when a complaint comes against a surveyor, professional surveyor, before the state board, it predominantly has to do with the actual survey itself. And it's probably because the surveyor is more in tune and more of a personal touch with the actual property owners, with the actual public, than the engineers are. Engineers tend to work for companies or a public agency that doesn't necessarily deal directly with individuals as much as. Now they still do, but so a lot of times the complaints for surveyors tend to be having to do the real life practical process, because they're out there in the field working on people's properties and people's boundaries, and people may or may not agree with them. And so the engineers, though, it's interesting that and you would read about this if we had them, we do not have a lot of failures of engineering design. There are some, and those make the news, and they're all usually not very good. So that's why we always try to have those factors of safety built into our designs. But they can come before the board if there's a problem. There are a couple now that had some failures in potential design. Again, you don't know that it's necessarily the design. We know from history that sometimes the design is good and somebody substituted a not similar or not equivalent material that could have caused a failure. So you kind of have to look at the whole picture, and sometimes those go through other venues, whether it's courts or other investigative agencies, to come to a conclusion. So we have to look at all those that come before us, but at the same time, sometimes the engineering side is more of the ethical side of some of the matters, and so that's what we're going to kind of talk about in the next few minutes. So one of them categories I guess I've picked up is stealing from employers. Now that doesn't sound very good. Absconding, borrowing indefinitely, whatever you want to call it, it's stealing from your employer. And that could be multiple things. It could be stuff. It could be items. It could be supplies, computers. Yes, we've had cases where engineers have decided upon leaving that they were owed a computer and just took it without verifying with the employer that it was okay to take. We've had some cases of not just I guess things, but intellectual property. As you're leaving one employer and going to another employer, there are some things that were created in an environment in that first employer's position that you may have to know, and it has to be very forthright. What are you allowed to take with you to another job, and what is proprietary to that previous employer? And we've had cases where people have it's more than an idea. It's actually the plans that were taken from a previous employer and used in another employer. So those are things that can happen that are basically, taking things that aren't yours, and maybe you think they're owed to you or whatever, but it can be a problem when they go through that. Similar to that is theft in office. That means you haven't really left. You're actually there, and there's theft in office. It's while you're there. I guess technically from an ethics standpoint, you could say, well, that could be time theft. It could be possession or items theft, but it's something that occurred. And sometimes it's where maybe it's not the value, it's not the actual thing that you took, but it could be something as simple as you had an opportunity to have something, or was given to you that nobody else had the opportunity to have. In other words, it's looking at your public employment and saying, did you benefit from that more than a non-public person could get? And so sometimes the Ethics Commission will look at that and say, is that something that's fair or not fair? Is it de minimis? Is it something that you got an advantage of over others? So again, those are things that do come before the state board. In that case, it's things that will come up in another venue. And so when you talk about theft in office, you're talking about the Ethics Commission and probably a court of law that has to go through their process before then we would look at what does that mean for the engineer. This is an interesting one coming up: embezzlement of funds. Now, I used to think that's hard to do, and then you read the news and you see Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, people in charge of pool memberships, and banks, and just about anything. There's people that are taking funds that aren't theirs, and so it becomes an issue. It could be embezzlement of funds from your employer. It could be just embezzlement from others that is not having to do anything with your actual job, but maybe there is a way that you embezzle funds from a financial institution, or again somebody else that you took funds from. And so that talks about character, that talks about many issues, and it may not be specifically engineering related, but it does have to look at what are you doing. Theft of food. Really? We talk about theft, but why of food? I don't understand it, but we've had in the past couple of years a rash of theft that professional engineers have done with food. We've had a case where steaks were stolen from a grocery store. It was very apparent as they were going through, and of course, there are cameras everywhere. I don't know why you do that, but we had an engineer that the case came before us that they had been convicted, not just accused, but convicted of theft of steaks from a grocery store. We've also had a case in food where another engineer had actually gone in and had switched the labels between regular and organic fruit and was taking all the more expensive fruit at the lower price. And again, cameras were able to catch that. And you go, why would you even want to jeopardize your engineering or surveying license for something as minimal as that for a few dollars? But it was a case that actually came before us. It was the ones that they were convicted of and then came before the board. Probably one of the sadder ones was, and this was again caught on camera, was there was a blind person that was selling bananas in his job, and people would actually go and swipe the bananas without paying for them. That really sounds low, and yet those are actual engineers that had a lapse of judgment, and again were convicted, and then the case after they were convicted in court were brought to us, for those kind of things. So again, it's not always engineering, it's not just design. And then we have moral turpitude. In moral turpitude, we've had cases of rape, of sexual assault, of regular assault. People sometimes, the drinking can get out of hand, and then you get into fights and things happen. We've had a case, which is it was a sack of White Castle hamburgers that somebody kept throwing at a person. So the assault by White Castle, I guess, was one of them. And so you have to look at those and say, how does one defend against those violations that are ethical and moral conduct? Because we have the principles and that's why we have the court system. That's why we have the ethics commission to say, hey, thou shalt not do this, or you shall do this. But how do you defend against that? What's very interesting is that most of the attorneys that come and represent the engineers or surveyors will say it's not engineering. You can't take away their license. This had nothing to do with engineering. Probably the biggest theft we've had was somebody that had actually embezzled over $1 million, and the whole case was, well, it had nothing to do with engineering, so you can't take his engineering license. I'm thinking, how trustworthy would an employer feel if this person hadn't been convicted or still is practicing, after that kind of a theft? So it doesn't matter whether it's engineering or surveying. It's an issue of, did you break laws that are in place, whether it's engineering or not, societal laws that you have to look at. So some of the things you have to look at, right? What am I going to do to make sure that I'm not going to be putting myself in a big problem? If the phrase pops up, it's just a little thing, no one will notice, could be an early detection. Probably don't want to go down this route. Or it's just a little thing, it won't hurt anyone. Well, there's a lot of convictions that were just probably what they thought were little things, and they did end up. And here's a good one: everyone else is doing it. Well, that doesn't make it right, right? We say that to our kids all the time. Just because they're doing it doesn't make it right. You're not going to do it. So little phrases. Or, oh, here you go. Hopefully so-and-so won't find out. That hopefully mom won't find out. Hopefully the spouse won't find out. Hopefully the boss won't find out. Well, any which way it goes, it's probably going to be a potential ethical conflict that you probably shouldn't be doing. We've all had people in our lives that I think have had good influences on us. I have a good number of people, men and women in the past, that have given me positive direction in my life. And Bill Lode is one of them. He's since passed away, but he was a very active professional engineer, professional surveyor, very proud of that fact, and he did a lot of teaching on ethics. And one of the things he used to say is there were two things that really he would analyze a situation to determine if he was going to be able to go forward in this situation or have to stop. And one of them was, what if this showed up on the front page of the paper? And the other is, what if my mother found out? What would happen? And it really doesn't matter what age you are. If your mother finds out something that she thinks shouldn't have happened, you're in trouble. And so I think those are two really good things, because usually if things are on the front page nowadays, it's not good news, it's probably bad news. So you want to make sure that whatever you're doing, gee, if this shows up on the front page, is that going to be a good news or bad news thing? And what happens if my mom finds out? So the other thing to look at is, I've mentioned the Ohio Ethics Commission quite a few times. I've given you their information, and you can just type in ethics.ohio.gov on the internet and track them down. They are not just the police. They do have to investigate and research and advise, but what is even better that they do is they will give you advice and give you recommendations before you do something. So if you have something that's coming up that you're not sure if it's really going to be in the best situation, you can call them, you can email them, and they will respond to you very quickly. They have particular lawyers on staff that will give you that advice, and in talking to some of their staff, if they give you advice, you hang on to that, because that can be used to help defend you if there's a problem, if you follow the advice that they give you. So I think it's a very handy resource that we have. I know a lot of people, before they do something, they will ask that question of the Ethics Commission to make sure that they're covered and not going down the wrong track. And the one thing I do like is they have ethics advisory emails that go out every so often. It's just nice to be on the mailing list of those. And then usually it's if there's a question that was a high enough priority, or multiple people have asked the same question, they'll put together an advisory opinion that they'll publish out on their emails. So I think with that, I want to be able to leave some time, because Mike, I know you've been, hopefully there's people that have asked some questions or want to know some more information. Thought I'd take a break here and see what might be in the inbox.
Okay, thanks, Dean. We've just had one general question asking how some of these cases have been resolved. So you mentioned some really interesting cases in several of those categories. Maybe you could sort of talk through how the boards have ruled on some of those.
Right. So that's a good question. And, it's like a lot of things. Maybe a good analogy is if you get caught speeding, you can go 1 mile over the speed limit and you're technically in violation of the speed limit. Or you can go 30 miles over and you're in violation of the speed limit. But the penalties are different of whether you're 1 mile or 30 miles. In one case, they might just give you a warning. If it's in a small amount. In fact, that sometimes there's that grace area that isn't official, but you think, okay, if I do a couple miles an hour over, I might be okay. But 25, 30 miles an hour over the speed limit, if they catch you, it's not only a ticket, it's a more expensive ticket, and it's a bigger fine. So from that standpoint, if for whatever reason something happens and you have to go before the state board, it depends what it is. It depends what the case is and how severe it is as to what the solution would be. And so sometimes we have cases where it's no action because there wasn't anything that rose to that level. In other cases, there may be a warning letter written. Some cases there could be probation. It could be a temporary loss of license, or it could be a permanent loss of license. You really don't want to go with the permanent loss of license. It's very difficult to get back, and most other states would have the same issue. If you've done something bad enough to lose your license, it is difficult to get back. So that is one of those things where some of the cases, as I mentioned, it depends again if they were convicted and what the conviction was. You can be convicted in a court of a misdemeanor, and that's different than a felony. So, felony, there's a good chance you're going to lose your license on a felony, but on a misdemeanor, probably not. And it could be anywhere from, and again, it depends what the case is. We didn't even talk about what happens if you, on your renewal application, which you'll be doing in probably December of 2021, you have to sign a statement saying, I've taken all the continuing professional development hours that are required of me based on the section of code. And if you sign that and you didn't take it, what happens? Well, if you get audited and they find that out, and then what happens is you've got two problems. One is that you didn't fulfill the requirements that you said you did, and two, you've just lied on a government form, which is not a good thing. So, but there's ways to rectify that. You may have to take additional courses. There may be a fine involved. It isn't necessarily automatically losing your license on that, but it is something that there is some need to have some sort of penalty assessed because you didn't follow the rules. So I would say the majority of our cases, we try not to have loss of license unless it's something very severe or like a felony conviction. But if it's anything else in the range, a lot of times it'll be probation or a fine, or you need to take some more CBD courses and a particular topic.
Well,
So,
Dean, yeah, thanks for those comments. Dean, if you want to look at the chat box, I have copied some additional questions. They've been tumbling in, which is pretty good. So I think the next question is from 1:39 p.m. regarding infractions that are maybe not directly related to engineering. It's from a traffic engineer. And Dean, maybe you could read through that one and comment on that.
yeah, I'm backing up to the 139 comment.
Okay.
So if you commit a traffic infraction, speeding, running red light, has that ever been considered by the ethics board for discipline? So one is I can't really speak on behalf of the ethics board because I'm not a member of the ethics board. So I don't know necessarily all the things that they've done for discipline. It seems like if it's something small, which, as long as nobody's hurt, and you say you ran a red light or you caught for a low grade speed, those probably don't go to the ethics commission. They've got their hands full of theft in office and some other issues. It's the court has determined the penalty on that, and that's usually sufficient enough probably from the ethics board. You could always ask that of the ethics board. That might be a good, interesting question to hear I've never really thought about asking the ethics board that. From our board, no, that's, as far as from a licensing board and from an engineers and surveyors license, those are fairly minor, and depending on any other extenuating circumstances, those may not, arise to a major offense from the engineering standpoint.
Well, Dean, thanks. I've copied a bunch more into the chat box, so if you just want to proceed down the list, that would be great.
Yeah. Okay, so there's one that says, how do engineering and surveying ethics requirements apply to reporting unethical behavior you observe? That is important because if you read through the 47, 33, 35, you as a licensed engineer or surveyor are required to report things that could be harmful to the public. And so if an unethical behavior is happening, that is something that may need to be reported. That doesn't mean that the board would 100% always say, yep, that was wrong. They may find out that it wasn't wrong, but it's something that if you do feel there's a problem and you haven't been able to talk to that person, sometimes, you can talk to the people and work some of those out. But if it's something that you don't think is going to be worked out and you need to report it, you do have the responsibility to report it. And that's why we have to go through the process, and not everything rises to the level of losing your license. It's just a matter of making sure that people are all following the same ethical practices. So the next question, I guess, as a follow-up is, can I explain anything about appropriate methods of reporting potential violations? Sure. And so whether it's in this case, it says like surveyors not meeting 473337, which is the surveyor's minimum standards. If you think those are violations, you can report those to the board. We do look at all complaints that are registered. It's a lot easier if they're not anonymous, because anonymous ones, we can't ask follow-up questions to somebody that doesn't tell us any more details, so it becomes more complicated. And there are times everybody makes a mistake, and if somebody forgets to do one thing on one survey and they've done a couple hundred surveys, that's not really rising to a level of incompetence. But if somebody has been doing something consistently on 10 or 20 surveys over the past year, and they haven't been forthright in fixing anything that they've done, that then becomes probably more of a serious investigation that will have some consequences. So as far as how to send it in, you can email it in. You can do the old-fashioned handwritten one if you want, send it to the board, and then those are given to the investigation team to look at, and then it's discussed and to see how far it needs to go. Sometimes things take a little bit of time, but it's to make sure we have due process. And so if a complaint's logged with anybody, we will look to see if anybody else has logged similar complaints, if there's been any other previous issues with an engineer or surveyor. We would also look at frequency and amount of issues. If there's 15 things wrong with a survey plat versus 2 things wrong with the survey plat, there's a difference there too in terms of competence. And sometimes people just forget things or so. So we do look at that. One of the things we do, I haven't mentioned here, but is something we look at. We regulate licensed engineers and surveyors. We also have a concern about people practicing without a license, and sometimes those are cases that are brought before us. But see, we only control licensees. So if somebody is practicing without a license, we actually have to go through the legal system and the court system to follow up on those. But you're more than welcome to email us, and if there's details, it helps to be able to share that, to be able to sort through all the issues that may be occurring. Let's see the next one. Could you speak to professional relations, specifically disparaging comments and going to public officials with opposition to another professional's design? Oh, that's the ugliest bridge I've ever seen. I would never put that in my community. I guess that would be considered disparaging. It's not necessarily, I mean, it could be a perfectly well-designed bridge, but it is something that, as professions, we need to hold ourselves as professions and professionals that we deal with. So no, I wouldn't want to do that. I wouldn't want to do that from a surveying standpoint, from an engineering design standpoint. That's one that I think that's where we have to rise to that level that puts us above other professions, that puts us above other groups, so that people can look at it and say, there may be, one person out of 100 or one person out of 1,000 that really makes engineers or surveyors look bad. but the rest of us are trying to make engineers and surveyors look good. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of things. You know, my mom used to say, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. And so, yeah, sometimes there's nicer ways to say things or talk about things as opposed to being disparaging to people. I think that's something that we need to make sure that we're being a little bit more higher standard in our comments, in our decisions. And I guess when you look through the code of ethics that we have as engineers and surveyors, in 47, 33, 35, it actually says, you know, we will only comment on what we know things about, and not just make guesstimates or make rash comments. Okay, so then the question, next question, how are we doing on time? Hopefully okay, Mike? Yep, we still got some time here.
Yep, doing
question
good.
is,
Yep.
yeah, is it okay to copy typical details for a client, U.S. government in this case, from drawings owned by the client, which I assume means the U.S. government, but from another design firm, as long as I verify it works by my calculations? Okay, well, that's a good, generally specific, but kind of general question. If things are from a government entity, usually those are open for people to have. My example is there's a lot of things in the Library of Congress and National Archives that if you go in and research, you can get copies of for free. Now, some people will take those and sell them, and that's their benefit, but you can get them for free. So whether it's U.S. government or how government, if there are certain standards or specs that they have that they publish, those are usually acceptable to copy and paste and use in your documents. Now, if you're getting them from another design firm, if they've created something, I would probably ask permission before I just blanket copy something from another design firm. And when we talk about it, that question kind of talked about typical details versus you verifying it for calculation purposes. So I don't know if that's really specifically talking about cross sections, typical sections. A lot of those are standard. Most, as you know, if we talk about typical sections for roadways, most subdivision regulations or municipal regulations have those that you are allowed to copy because that's what the standard is that they want you to use. So they should look similar, but you do want to make sure that you're not copying things that somebody else created that could be considered their property. But again, sometimes when we design things and it becomes public, it becomes public, owned by the government that originally contracted for it. Okay, so the question is, what checks and balances are in place to help ensure that the state boards and Ohio Ethics Commission are acting ethically in rendering their decisions? Well, that's a great question, because obviously the Ethics Commission better be following the ethics rules and procedures. They have, I think, a very, I guess you can always appeal that in a court. So like if you thought that their decision was wrong, you might be able to take that to court. You can also, from the state board standpoint, at some point, if you thought that the decision wasn't proper, you could appeal that. It's a little harder if you're the actual person. You can appeal it, and it can be reconsidered or whatever. It's harder if you think somebody got off scot-free and you want them to be penalized. It may be harder for you to appeal that. But I think that the key is there consistency? Is the Ethics Commission and the state boards, are they being consistent in how they handle these different cases? As long as there's consistency, I think that's a much better solution and a much better result than if it's more, well, you know what, I guess we think this one is a little bit harsh, and oh, this one we want to be a little tougher on, and it's the same thing. You really have to get those away from decision making. So if I would say that if you would say, hey, these aren't consistent, then I think that's a case where you'd want to make that known to the Ethics Commission or to the state board. In the most part, though, I think that's not knowing the Ethics Commission directly how they deliberate, but I can tell you that from a state board standpoint, our deliberations do look at what did we do in this case before, what have we done in the past 5 years, what do we even have a case like this before. Those are all looked at before just arbitrarily making a decision. We do, part of the investigation is not just what happened, but how did that happen in relationship to other things that are similar or the same. It says on average, how many cases does the board review a year, and are cases increasing or decreasing? That's an ebb and flow type of thing. When we first started reviewing continuing professional development, that was something new, and so those, for the most part, people were following that, and every so often you have some that weren't doing it, and that's really been a low number, which is good. When we came out, this is, and again, 20 plus years ago, when we talked about plan stamping, and we tried to educate, don't plan stamp, don't sign things that you weren't responsible for overseeing. That has decreased tremendously, which is good. They still pop up once in a while, but the number of cases on that particular subject has gone down. So I think that's good. We have cases where people are practicing without a license. They could be an engineer or a surveyor that didn't renew properly. They moved. They didn't tell us they moved, so they didn't get a notification. They forgot to sign. So they've been surveying or performing engineering design without a license. So that's a problem. Not increase or decrease, it's just a problem. Or companies, if you're a company, you have to have a certificate of authorization to practice engineering or surveying, and you need to make sure that that's a license. It's a license to be able to practice engineering or surveying with that company. If they don't do that, that can be a problem. So I think those tend to crop up a little bit more because sometimes it's not the principal owner that is filling out those forms. Average number of cases we probably have on the dockets, probably 50 to 100 cases. Some go through rather quickly, some take a little bit longer. Some sit there while we're waiting for a court case to go through, and we just have to wait until the proper procedures occur. Let's see. Mike, you just jump in and tell me if I end up getting too close to going over, but I'll say this one: are there often cases where a professional is working outside their expertise and they violated ethics laws? For example, performing civil engineering when a person is licensed as an electrical engineer. Once in a while, and again, whether it's your engineering or surveying, you are required to practice in your area of expertise. And we don't license by discipline. So an engineer comes before us, and it doesn't say he's a civil engineer coming before us, but that's probably if that's where his area of practice is. And then somebody says, but he's been doing mechanical engineering or electrical engineering or something else. That may be well and good if the person has gotten some additional training in those areas. I remember years ago, I'll just put it that way, when GPS first came out on the forefront for normal, regular surveyors to use, not just the government. How do you get trained on that? I mean, you can't be a GPS expert without learning how to do it. And so it took a little bit of time for people to acquire that ability, but it wasn't being taught in schools. It was something that was being taught in the experience side of the profession. And once you got that experience, then you could say, hey, I'm a GPS specialist if you wanted to do that. But again, you have to show that you are learned in that particular area of your profession.
Dean, we are at 2 p.m. in just a moment here. We have lots of questions. This is probably the most questions I've ever seen submitted for a 1 hour webinar. So really a great response from the audience. Um, Dean, I don't know, maybe we can generate a list of questions to get to you by email, or if you're okay with the idea of individual people contacting you directly after the webinar to ask questions, is that okay?
Yeah, yeah. Let me give you, I didn't give you my email. If you want, I'll just verbally say it if you want me to. You want to do that?
Sure, absolutely.
All right. So an email that you could write to me on, and then of course, if it's more appropriate for a different division to answer that, like the Ethics Commission, I would say please, go ahead and send it to them. But I'm willing to tackle it if you want. My individual email is first initial last name, so it's DRINGLE at ceao.org. So it's the County Engineers Association of Ohio, abbreviated. And
Great.
yeah, because again, we're out of time. So if you want to go through the questions and if anybody else has a question, to go ahead and shoot it our way, and we'll try to help out. We have an executive director for the State Board of Registration. His name is John Greenhalgh. He likes to talk about this stuff too, so sometimes I'll pass over questions and he can answer them. But again, we want to be able to address any questions people have.
Well, Dean, thank you so much for presenting this webinar. We really appreciate it. And thanks so much, everybody, for participating today. So with that, we are adjourned. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, everybody.